So in the process again of how we do the inspection, we've talked about the roof, we've talked about the gutters and the drainage system. So the next area which comes to bear, what we look at is the siding of a house and the trim around the siding and that type of thing. And so also vegetation. So I wanted to, before I get into the siding, I want to talk a little bit about vegetation and what we're looking for there. It seems prevalent that there's a lot of times we plant bushes and plants and vines and ivies and things like that around our house. And especially we see this with new construction. And after about 10 years, you plant a plant that's only 6 inches tall. When it's planted, next thing you know, it's 2 feet, 3 feet tall, and it's up against your house. And so what we like to see basically is maintaining a distance away from your house, especially with bushes and plants, of at least a foot, maybe 2 feet away from the house. So first off, let the siding ventilate. And the other thing is to keep the siding off, or to keep the vegetation off of the siding. If we start seeing vines and ivy and ground cover growth basically going up and underneath of the siding, that's an opportunity for bugs to get into the wall cavities of your house, whether it's ants or nuisance pests, typically not termites, but things like that. And also moisture. So when you're dealing with vegetation, you're also dealing with that vegetation's holding moisture against the siding, which can create, again, dry rot types of issues against the siding. So that's always the first thing we want to look at, is where the vegetation is, where the trees are. We like to keep the tree limbs trimmed away from the house at least 3 to 4 feet. Rodents, squirrels, rats, things of those nature, they can jump. And once they jump and actually get onto your roof surface, they can actually crawl up there and gnaw into and get into your attic areas. So we want to make sure our tree limbs are trimmed back at least a couple, 3 or 4 feet away from the house. Your bushes and plants at least a foot or 2 away from the house. And the other thing that we're looking for is ground cover when it comes up next to the siding. So we'll typically put beauty bark in and rocks and things like that around our house, and it'll be right up against the siding. You want to try to maintain a distance. I encourage people 6 to 8 inches at minimum of any earth to wood contact between that siding and the dirt or beauty bark. Again, it's going to retain moisture for the most part, and then it could wick up into the trim boards or into the siding that's over the top of it and create issues for us that way. So we'll be very aware of keeping vegetation off the house. So as we look at that, we're also looking at the types of siding. So there are numerous types of sidings out there. You'll see a plethora of different types of sidings, and there's different types of manufacturers. We see everything from plywood planks. We see what's called hardy plank now, which is a cementitious type of board. We're still seeing cedar siding, horizontal and vertical siding. Regardless of the type of siding that we're seeing, all that siding still needs to be maintained, meaning that you should probably theoretically think about painting your house about every 8 to 10 years. One, because therefore you can check the joints, you can check the corners, the inside corners, the joints, all the other types of penetrations on the siding. So it's good to clean your siding. It's also good to think about painting your house once every 8 to 10 years. Basically keep a good coat of paint on there. As you're painting, also the prep work, whether you do it yourself or you hire a professional to come out and paint your house, the prep work is important to take out any old loose flaking caulk and things like that, and basically put in new caulking materials. As you look at the siding, again, there's siding that runs in a vertical fashion, and it could be a 4x8 sheet of siding. It could be horizontal siding, whether that's cedar or again, we're seeing a lot of hardy plank type of siding out there. And again, that's a cementitious type of board. And just because it's a cementitious, in other words, it has cement mixture, it's very dense, very hard, very, very resilient, very durable. It still will deteriorate if given the conditions of typically moisture against that type of siding, but it wears well and it weathers extremely well. Cedar siding, great siding. Again, it's a type of siding that we don't see a lot. It's more expensive than what hardy plank is. So when we also look at houses, you may look at a house in the front elevation, what it looks like, the motif of it, may be different than actually what's on the sides of the house or in the back of the house, only because of the aesthetic appearances from the road. So you may have a different type of siding, looks nicer than what's on the sides. And so typically we'll see either hardy plank or cedar horizontal type of siding on the front of the house. And then on the sides of the house, you may see vertical sheets, basically 4x8 types of sheets of the siding. Wherever you have siding, you'll also have joints in the siding. And so it's very imperative that when we're looking at siding is how those joints are weather protected. Sometimes you'll see a piece of trim board that goes across those joints, and then typically that should be caulked on the top of that trim board so it keeps water from penetrating in and behind the trim board. You'll also see times where the trim board will be there and there will be metal flashing over the trim board, and that's called Z, as in zebra. And it looks like a Z. It kind of comes down, goes over the top of the trim, and then it has a little lip that comes down. And basically that's, again, for water drainage away from that trim and to keep it from the siding. So on your windows, your door penetrations, what we're actually looking for there too is that Z metal area that's over the tops of the doors, around the window, tops of the window jambs, that type of installation basically keep water from running in and behind there. When we get to the siding, what we're looking for is moisture issues, deteriorated siding on the south side of the house, again, because we get the brunt of the weather here. We're looking for weathered siding that's basically at the end of its useful life expectancy. It's not uncommon as an inspector to use a probe. Basically, I use an awl, and it has a sharp point on it. And so sometimes I'll poke that siding, or I'll sound the siding to listen to. It'll sound different if it's not a solid integrity type of surface. You start probing on it and you listen to the sound. You may go ding, 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 donk. You know there's an issue there. So we're very concerned about the trim work around those types of areas. Where you have trim that comes down the sides of your windows, a lot of times you'll have a header piece, and then you have the trim sides that come down, then you'll have a bottom piece as a decorative piece. Those types of areas where that water actually comes down and you have the window inside of that trim, because of the water from the window and the water that's coming down the face, we see a lot of the ends of the trim where it actually comes down to the bottom of the board underneath of the window or the penetrations. That piece of trim there, or those side pieces of trim, will get deteriorated just because of water over a long period of time. So if we're buying a house and doing your inspection, and or if you're a current homeowner and you're looking at it, you definitely want to look around those trim pieces to make sure there's no dry rot. And it does happen at the top as well. So you really want to look at those, maybe take a little awl or your pocket knife or something and just poke in there. And if it's soft, you really want to replace that sooner than later. If that's soft, then basically what that's an indication of is deteriorated, and we don't want that deterioration moving back into the structure, the substructure of the house, the plywood or the OSB oriented strand board siding or physical characteristics of the house that are behind there. So those are types of areas that are very prevalent to get water. When we look at doors around the house, so on the exteriors we're looking at the doors. A lot of times over the tops of the doors we'd like to see the Z metal over the tops of the trim. That trim typically is referred to as brick mold, and it's a different type of trim. Basically it's very prevalent around doors and jambs. And although at the base of the doors, where it meets the threshold at the bottom of the door, because of water coming down the sides of that trim, we find a lot of times at the base of the trim where it comes down to the ground of the threshold, we see a lot of times deterioration in those tails or those bottom parts of there. If that's getting in there, it's definitely getting into the substructure of the house as well. You definitely want to take those off and replace those and make any repairs, any concealed damage that may be behind there. The other thing that we see a lot of times when we have either French doors and or just typical doors, but most certainly French doors. French doors in this part of the country, for whatever reason, it's kind of interesting that those doors don't have a good weather seal to them. We find probably more issues in French doors and the jambs and leaking because there's several moving components. You have basically two doors that are moving. They're hinged on both sides. They have a gap in the middle of them where they come together and latch and lock. So you have more opportunity for more water types of penetrations and weather penetrations into French doors. When we see sliding glass doors, one thing that we're looking for around those most certainly is any types of water penetrations, but we may not sometimes see that from the exterior of the house. A lot of times, as an experienced inspector, I will tell you from the inside of the crawl space, that's probably one of the biggest areas I will go to is where those door penetrations are, whether it's a French door, a sliding glass door, a regular exterior door. If there's a crawl space area that's behind there, those typically we will find a lot of times where we have dry rot issues inside of the crawl space underneath of those doors. Visually looking at it, from the exterior, you don't see any deterioration in the jambs. You don't see anything, but from the inside of the crawl space, one, just because how water can wick and go underneath of the threshold, and then it gets into the crawl space or into the subfloor that's behind that door. We find a lot of issues there with doors on a house. So as a homeowner and or as an inspector looking at your house for the first time, it's imperative that we want to go to those penetrations and look inside the crawl space if there indeed is a crawl space in the house. We find a lot of issues with those types of doors. With any type of siding, whether it's a vertical type of siding, you'll want to know or have the inspector tell you what type of siding that is. We, for the most part, will know exactly what type of siding it is. One type of siding that we didn't mention on that I want to speak about is a composition type of siding. A lot of people refer to it as LP, Louisiana Pacific. LP is a compressed board. If you went onto YouTube and actually watched how this was manufactured, it's manufactured under heat and resin, and it's compressed, and it starts out really, really thick, and then as the heat and the resin and the compression takes place, basically what happens is it goes into its format of, let's say, 3" to a 1/2 inch thick. What happens a lot of times with the composition type of siding, we'll just refer to it as LP for no other better word, and not that it's only LP. There are other brands that are out there. Weyerhaeuser has a brand. There's probably some knockoff types of brands out there, so I'm not specifically saying LP or any other type of siding is bad, so I want to make that very clear. But when you have a composition siding, basically it's a compressed board that's been put together by resin and heat. Because of that, when we have water against that type of siding, it will sometimes swell. And the issues with that siding is because where the siding comes down, you have one that goes over the other. Those lips, that water will sit on that lip. And as that lip becomes water penetrates into that, over time that lip will start to swell and start to open up. When that happens, bacteria and then mold and dry rot occurs in that, and then that starts actually separating, then it can continue wicking back up into those areas. A lot of times what we're looking for there too is where the nails go into that. For the most part, all the nails on siding should be what we call blind nailed. In other words, you don't see any nails. They're all hidden underneath of where the one siding comes underneath of the other one, and the nails are hidden. Although sometimes you will see nails in the field, what we call the field, and therefore you can visually see those. If we see swelling around those nail heads, in other words, then that means that the siding is starting to weather and it's starting to separate and move away, and therefore then the nails are swelling around those nail heads. That's a good indication that siding is going bad. Earlier I referred to painting your house about every 8 to 10 years. With a composition siding, it's imperative, and it's not just with composition, but it's most certainly more prevalent with composition siding, is that what we don't do a lot of times is we don't paint those lips really, really well. So when you paint the house, you also want to prime the siding. And you may think that just taking a sprayer, which we'll see a lot of, paint sprayers, and you'll go out there and you'll spray your house and spray your house. Well, that's fine for the field, but we're neglecting that underside of that lip. That sometimes takes basically manual labor, taking a brush taking that same paint and brushing those lips extremely well. Basically, those are our biggest problems with the composition siding is the edges of that siding where it comes down and that water sits in there for a long period of time. So as a maintenance issue, if we're looking at the house for the first time, you're purchasing the house, we most certainly want to look at those areas very, very closely. Just because it's starting to swell, although it doesn't mean it's entirely bad and it has to be replaced right now. It is something that can be remediated, and that swelling can be held to a minimum if the siding is prepped, prepared, primed, and painted. You could get another, I don't know, sometimes 5 to 10 years of life expectancy out of the siding. So it's not just a case where we see that the composition siding is starting to swell and there's deterioration that it has to be replaced. That's not typically sometimes the biggest part of it. Yes, sometimes it does have to be replaced, and we'll call to have that done. When you do replace it, you really want to look at the different other types of sidings that are out there. The hardy plank type of siding, the cementitious type. Hardy plank is a brand name, Hardy Plank. That's the corporation name, HP. And they make a good siding, whether it's in a horizontal fashion or they do make 4x8 sheets. They also make simulated shake type of sidings. Those types of things actually look like cedar shakes, but they're actually hardy plank as well. So you really want to look at the type of siding you're going to go back with for longevity. Again, better to spend a little bit more money than you plan than a little less than you should have. The composition siding will typically be a little bit less in expense, but the installation process is still the same. Basically, it has to be adhered to. The structure of the house has to be nailed, has to be caulked, things of that nature. Caulking of hardy plank siding. Most other types of siding where the joints come together in the field, you'll see that those joints are not caulked, and that is actually by design. Hardy Plank came out with some directives a few years back that said we don't caulk those joints anymore, but behind there's a water plane flashing that they actually put behind the joints as a water plane, so therefore the siding can expand and contract. Because it's very dense and very brittle, not very brittle, it's not brittle, but it's very dense. You don't want those two areas coming together and creating pressure, then it could basically fracture the siding at those areas where it comes together. So do not be surprised if you're buying a house and it has hardy plank siding on it, that the joints are not caulked. That is very, very normal practice now, very much industry standard, and that's what the manufacturer specifies, is not to caulk those areas, because there is a vapor. When it was installed, there's a drainage plane that's been installed behind those joints. For the most part, all the other siding does need to be caulked in the joints, and it's just a maintenance issue of keeping an eye on those types of areas.